This week, your readings focus in on stress and health and what psychology research has shown for each of these topics. For the lecture, I want to highlight dealing with stress and what research has shown leads to, let's say, a happier life and a healthier life, and so on. Where a lot of research has focused is on the idea of having control. People that have more control in their life typically have more positive outcomes. So personal control seems to be extremely beneficial. There are many studies that have looked at this, but one of the big ones, and one of the ones that is highlighted briefly in your book, looked at elderly people in a nursing home. And these elderly people were given a plant in their room, and they wanted to alter control. So what they did is everyone got a plant, but half of them were controlling the watering themselves. So they were given control over the plant. The other half got the plant in their room, but someone watered it for them. You wouldn't think this would be a very big deal. However, the half that got the control, the half that were in charge of the plant themselves, were mentally and physically healthier over the next year. They needed fewer meds, and so on. So something this small, such as having control in your life over something small, can in fact be a really important thing. They've done studies that have looked at giving elderly people control over like their visitors and the schedule. So either to have people drop in unannounced at various times or at times when the person could themselves plan for. And again, having control seems to be very important. What about at the society level? Big picture. In the US, we like to be individuals. In the US, we value what's called individualism. And because of that, we typically are more likely when something goes right in our lives, we'll post it to social media and tell people about it, we'll brag, and so on. We make more money than most other parts of the world. However, there are in fact more depressed people in Western cultures compared to, let's say, like an Asian culture that's a bit more collectivist focused. So as much as having control and having these abilities to shine the spotlight on us and so on ourselves, take the praise and the acclaim that would come with our own accomplishments, there are some negatives to this as well. Also, control is good, but and a lot of people would think, I want to have a lot of options when I'm choosing something. I like to have the control and give me as many options as possible. But research has actually found that too many choices, too many items to choose from can in fact negatively impact happiness. For example, if you've ever tried to buy paint, you know just how difficult this is. There's 30 different types of yellow, and there's 30 different reds and so on. And what research has actually found is if you give someone like 5 options, like we like options, but we don't need that many, about 5 options, and people will be happy. You had a few options. You don't like to go to a store and only see one thing that they carry, but a couple seems to be good. People with fewer options are typically happier with their purchase than someone who had more options and maybe took longer to make it, and so on. What about optimism versus pessimism? Well, as in a quick nutshell, optimism is like when you anticipate that positive things will happen in your life, and being a pessimist would be more along the lines of anticipating that bad things or negative things might happen in your life. Most people would rather be optimistic, and a lot of research supports this. So optimism has been linked to well-being and being more successful and possibly living longer. However, optimists have also been known to take unnecessary risks in their life. So the optimist might have a little bit of chest pain and not think that it's a big deal, so they don't go to the doctor and therefore don't get treatment for something that in fact might be an issue. The pessimist, something goes wrong, they may in fact go to the doctor faster, and so on. Historically, people perceive optimists to be more naive than pessimists. You're so happy, that's just because you just don't know any better. If you look at like different philosophers and writers over the years, you find a ton of quotes like this one. This one's from Elbert Hubbard, that says that a pessimist is someone that has been intimately acquainted with an optimist, right? This negative view of the optimist, when in fact optimism does seem to lead to some benefits in life. That said, if you tend to skew to be a pessimist, there's some research out there that suggests that maybe you should just stay that way. Trying to force yourself to become an optimist when you're not, in fact, leads to stress, and stress, as we know from this chapter, leads to all sorts of negative consequences. So how do we manage stress? How do we stay healthy? Probably the most important thing in your life is to have a strong system of social support. You need someone to talk to, whether it be family, friends. There's even been research that suggests that if you stand in front of the mirror and talk to yourself for 5-10 minutes a day, that you in fact can lessen your stress. So having some sort of social network is important. Other people suggest that if you find something to do with your life that brings purpose, meaning to it, this is one reason why religion can be a very beneficial thing to people. But you don't have to find meaning in life through religion. You can find it through volunteering. You can find it through your career or your job. And it doesn't even have to be an abstract, really top-of-the-line job. There are people out there that report finding meaning with some very non-prestigious occupations. For example, doctors will discuss how they find meaning in their life because they're saving lives. But in fact, if you interview sometimes the custodial staff, like the janitors at the hospital, they'll talk about how they're saving lives as well because they are keeping the rooms clean, which is extremely important for health. And those janitors and custodians that can in fact view their job that way, as they are also saving lives and doing something extremely important, are more likely to have positive outcomes in their life and manage their stress and stay healthier. Of course, exercise is extremely important, and the rule of thumb seems to be somewhere around 30 minutes 3 times a week. So any kind of exercise you can do like that does seem to provide some benefits. Beyond 30 minutes 3 times a week, the research is mixed for whether or not that in fact will help you with stress and health and so on. Physically, of course, it will help, but mentally, 30 minutes 3 times a week is kind of the magic number for now. More won't do harm, but more might not get you more benefits. Finally, a time to relax or meditate or just deep breathe. Some people are finding this through yoga and other types of exercise regimens, but a time to kind of let go of everything in your life and so on. It seems to be extremely important. And this could be once a week, twice a week. The research hasn't exactly found the magic number yet for this, the way they have for exercise, but taking time out of your life to relax and maybe meditate or something along those lines does seem to lead to positive outcomes. Finally, a few things about happiness and about who is happier and so on. First off, happiness has nothing to do with your age. It has nothing to do with how much money you have. It has nothing to do with your education. It seems to have almost nothing to do with your race, virtually nothing to do with your health, very little to do with the climate that you live in. So Californians being in the sun all the time and so on are not happier than the rest of the world. And it has very little to do with whether you have children. It has nothing to do with your gender. Now, there are little pieces to each of these that might play a small role. For example, with wealth, what they have found is if you don't know where your next meal is coming from, then giving a little more money, a little more wealth, might in fact increase happiness. But once you have kind of a set minimum where you are, able to provide food for yourself each week, getting more money doesn't in fact raise happiness levels at all. Your age, 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, they're equivalently happy. So there doesn't seem to be any particular age group that is happy or less happy. Your education has nothing to do with it. Within race, there's been some studies that show higher levels of depression in Caucasians when you compare them to Hispanics. So there are maybe a little bit of variation there, but even that is a tiny, tiny, tiny amount. So race seems to have very little to do with it. For health, the research has suggested that if you have lots of health problems and big health problems, then it might play a role. But a couple of health problems here and there doesn't seem to matter. So for most people, health does not play that big of a role. Having children does not seem to impact it. They've looked at people who have kids and who don't, and there's no difference. They've examined even those that have kids, for example, like a stay-at-home mom, and they've asked them, when are you happiest during the day? And most of them say that the happiest time during their day is nap time, when the kids are in fact not her problem, or his problem, right? So if it's a stay-at-home dad. So again, having kids doesn't actually seem to correlate with happiness. As far as gender is concerned, males seem to have less fluctuation in their emotions. Females do definitely fluctuate with their emotions more, but in terms of happiness levels, both genders are equivalently happy. So if none of those things matter, what does matter? Well, happiness has been linked to, again, having a strong social network. So actually getting married is a good thing to do for happiness levels, because marriage usually increases social network. Instead of having just your social network, you now have your spouse's social network as well. Although there's a lot of research that says that being in a bad marriage is very bad for happiness. Being religious has been linked to happiness. This can give people's lives meaning, and to some extent, religion provides a social network. You get everyone at your place of worship that to discuss things with, and so on, a larger social system. Amount of personal control, we've already talked about that one, very important to happiness, and to some extent genetics. Happy people typically come from happy parents. About 50% of happiness seems to come from your genes, so there's plenty that comes from your situation around you, but genetics do play a role. The other interesting thing about happiness is it is relative to what's going on in your life. So it's relative to your own past. For example, I'm happier now than I was before because before this was going on in my life, and now I don't have that anymore, or now something better is going on. So we're very much comparing where we are now to where we've been before. And happiness is very, very relative in that way. The other thing about happiness is it is relative to everyone else around us. So for example, a lot of people say, I will be happy when and then they fill in the blank with buy a new car or buy a house or whatever it might be. Well, when you buy a house, you move into a neighborhood and everyone around you has a house. So instead of comparing yourself to all the people that you used to be around who maybe didn't have a house, now you start comparing yourself to everyone around you who in fact does have a house. And so your house doesn't feel nearly as special anymore. You're not unique for having that. So happiness is very much a relative game. This is probably why wealth doesn't increase happiness, because when you make, let's say, not so much money, you maybe hang out with other people that don't make as much money, or you compare yourself to those people. But when you then get a raise or you get a different job and you start making more, compared to how you used to be, maybe you can have more options now. But what happens is many times the people around you change, they make more money as well, or you get used to making all of this money, and now it's nothing special. The first paycheck or two after a raise, people are usually happier. But after about a month, they've gotten used to that money, and it's no longer special. So there's some really interesting stuff out there on happiness. We do offer a class at Rio Hondo called Positive Psychology. It's Psych 180. And if you're interested, I highly recommend taking that class.